Welcome to rePROs Fight Back, a podcast where we explore all things reproductive health, rights, and justice. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and I'll be helping you stay informed around issues like birth control, abortion, sex education, and LGBTQ issues, and much, much more. Giving you the tools you need to take action and fight back. Okay, let's dive in. Everyone, and welcome. I hope everybody is doing well. I'm having a bit of a down week this week, so I'm recording this the week before the episode came out, and my grandma died this week. She was 95 years old, and it's hard. I'm doing okay. It's just made this week a little bluer, and today when I'm recording, it's raining, so that's not helping either. You know, I'm trying not to be sad about it. She has been unhappy for a long time and not doing great. So it is for the best, but it doesn't make it any easier. My family is all in Wisconsin and I'm here in Washington, D.C. So it's hard to not be there. And it's also hard to think that, they're talking about having a celebration of her life in August, since they can only do something really small right now, and just not even being able to plan if I could possibly be there that far at something that far away. Makes it a little hard right now. But like I said, I'm trying not to be sad. I'm trying to think of happy things. So I figured I would just share a funny story from, let's see, this was right after I moved to DC. So I don't know, like 14 or 15 years ago. And I was home for Christmas, and my mom is one of 11 kids. So we have a very, very large Irish Catholic family that gets together every year for Christmas. And Grandma was harassing me about why I didn't have a boyfriend. And I said, well, Grandma, I met this really nice young man, and, he was really great, but he was a Republican. Did you want me to date a Republican? And Grandma's like, oh, no, that's definitely not that. I don't know why. It's just one of those things that sticks with me. Grandma was kind of spunky like that. So I just hope that made you laugh a little bit, made me laugh. And it's just nice to think of some of the happier things. So anywho, with that, I just wanted to talk about one other quick thing before we turn to this week's episode. And that is something we've talked about several times and always kind of have it as an action item when we talk about abortion, and that is abortion funds. So this past week is normally when abortion funds have their largest fundraiser every year, the fundathons, and they can raise up to half their annual budget during fundathon. And so since they haven't been able to have kind of the normal events they would have, like a bowl-a-thon or any of these other in-person gatherings, it's a little bit harder for them to raise money. So I know a lot of us are struggling right now. I am lucky and privileged enough that I was able to donate a little more this year to a couple different abortion funds. So if you are able, it would be a great time to donate to your local abortion fund or another local abortion fund. So I will make sure that we include a list of all of the local abortion funds in our show notes. They could use your love right now. Okay. And with that, let's turn to this week's episode. This week, we talk about the big Supreme Court case that is being heard tomorrow, if you're listening to this when it comes out, where they are going to be talking about the birth control benefit again. I know. It is 2020, and we are still fighting over birth control. Wild. Anywho, we have Mara Gandal-Powers from the National Women's Law Center with us to talk all about the birth control benefit and what is happening at the Supreme Court tomorrow. And with that, I'll turn it over to my great interview with Mara. Hi, Mara. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited for us to be together but apart.
I know. So I was actually going through and updating some stuff in all of my podcast files to make sure like the guests showed up better when you were online. And I realized you were one of my very first guests.
I think I may have been. It was, I remember coming to your office and sitting in the little podcast room. It was really fun. So I'm glad to be back.
I know. The sad thing is, one, we're not in person, but two, we're basically discussing the same thing.
Which
is attacks on birth control.
Yes. Birth control, awesome to always talk about, not this line of cases and things that continue to happen. So not awesome on that front.
No. Okay, so let's get started. Maybe we should do a little bit of like, how did we get here before we get to the SCOTUS case that's coming up?
Yeah, definitely. So there is a very long history of administrative rulemaking and multiple Supreme Court cases that have led us to where we are today. The one that many folks have probably heard of or that is clicking in their mind is the Hobby Lobby case, but there's a lot to it. So the cases that the court is going to hear on May 6th are about the rules that the Trump administration issued that will allow virtually any employer or university with religious or moral objections to birth control to exclude birth control from employee and student health plans. So how did we get all the way here where the Trump administration is doing that? And I think as most of your listeners probably know, the Affordable Care Act's birth control benefit is the part of the ACA that requires insurance plans to cover women's preventive services, including birth control, without co-pays, deductibles, or coinsurance. Like you get your birth control, it's paid fully by your insurance, and you don't have to take any money out of your pocket. And that part of the law has been a total game changer. It went into effect in August 2012. So we're like 7.5 years into this. And right now we know that about 61.4 million women have coverage of birth control without out-of-pocket costs because of it.
That's so amazing.
And when we think about it, I think about what's so great about it. First of all, your health insurance that you're paying for meets your needs, right? The specific needs of folks who need birth control. But also when you're not paying those out-of-pocket costs, which have been estimated in 1 year alone to be $1 billion, that money can be put towards other necessities like rent and utilities. So it really is a game changer, not just for your healthcare, but also for your, where your budget is. And the other thing that we know about the benefit that makes it so great is that we know that people are now making their choices about their birth control method based upon what they want and what their healthcare provider recommends, not just based on the high upfront costs. So in particular, we've seen some early evidence that more people are choosing the most effective kinds of birth control when they don't have that cost barrier, which is really great. People being able to make that choice without cost being the factor. So I think that the next thing to think about, birth control benefit, great, doing really great things. But this all really does date back to some of the regulations and things that happened when the Obama administration was implementing the ACA. So the Obama administration issued regulations that sort of would give health plans an understanding of how to cover preventive services. And, one of the things that they did was they created a religious exemption for a narrow set of churches and other religious institutions that object to birth control coverage. And so folks who were in those plans didn't have birth control coverage at all. And after they announced that exemption, there was a large outcry from other religious organizations, religiously affiliated organizations that object to birth control coverage. And so over about 18 months, there were several rounds of administrative rulemaking where, the Obama administration issued proposed rules. People like the National Women's Organization, and I'm sure many of your listeners wrote comments saying, here's what would work, here's what wouldn't work, here's what the impact would be. And at the end of all of this, the administration finalized the exemption, and they also created what is known as the accommodation, which is for religiously affiliated nonprofit organizations that had an objection to birth control coverage. And so what's really important to know about the accommodation is that while it allowed birth control to be excluded from the plans for eligible organizations, it ensured that people in those plans still got birth control coverage. And I think a real world example helps people understand that a little bit better.
Yes.
So say you are a nurse or a medical assistant and you work at a religiously affiliated hospital that objects to birth control coverage. The plan that you get through your employer would exclude birth control coverage, but a third party would step in, and that's usually the insurance company, to ensure that you get birth control without out-of-pocket costs, just like everybody else, right? So your experience working at that religiously affiliated hospital that objects to birth control coverage, your experience of getting birth control would be the same as if you worked at any other hospital that didn't object to birth control coverage. And that's really key, right? So the administration set up a process that, while not perfect, does ensure that people get the birth control that they need. So that's sort of what happened on the regulatory side. And then we get to Hobby Lobby. So in the midst of all this regulatory work happening, the lawsuits against the birth control benefit started popping up. And there were several that were filed by for-profit corporations, so, for-profit businesses like Hobby Lobby, who said, we object to birth control coverage too. This violates our rights under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which most people who deal with it a lot refer to as RFRA. And those cases made their way up to the Supreme Court, and a closely divided court ultimately ruled in 2014 and said, certain companies like Hobby Lobby could use RFRA to get out of complying with the benefit. But the court also made clear that employees at those companies still need birth control coverage. So after the case was decided, there was more rulemaking done by the Obama administration. And these kind of companies now also got the accommodation, right? So closely held for-profits got the accommodation as well, which is really important because that means the people who work there could get the birth control that they need. Then there was another line of lawsuits. It's kind of like keeps on growing.
Never ending. It just
never ending.
It was ridiculous.
And those ones were filed by nonprofit organizations, and they claimed that the accommodation process itself violated their rights under RFRA. So the things that they had to do to say, I object to birth control coverage, signing a paper or telling their insurance company that they object,
a piece of
those
paper.
things in and of themselves, they said violated their rights under RFRA. And that line of cases made its way up to the Supreme Court. The one that was the named case was Zubik versus Burwell. It was argued in 2016. And what's interesting, we actually didn't get a decision from the court in that case. What we got was an order sending the consolidated cases back down to the various circuit courts that they had come up with through, and directing the parties, so that is, the nonprofits that were objecting and the federal government, to reach a resolution that would ensure access to birth control. So essentially the court was saying, we really think you guys can figure this out. We're not ruling here. And these cases were still sitting in the courts when the transition in administrations happened in January 2017, which sort of takes us up to the beginnings of where we are now.
Yeah. It was a really long and strange road. And I just remember every time I would see a new lawsuit popping up, just being like, wait, are you kidding me?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's honestly dozens and dozens of lawsuits. And in many cases, these folks are represented by the same people, but, somewhat coordinated from the folks who were objecting to birth control coverage. Yeah. But seemingly almost whack-a-mole in a way.
Right. Okay. So you're right. That brings us up to the Trump-Pence administration. So what did they do that changed things?
So, yeah, I think, I was sort of expecting the birth control benefit to be one of the first things this administration tried to go after when they came into power in 2017. And we didn't see it, anything officially happening for a little while. First thing we saw was in May 2017, the president issued a so-called, and if you could see me, I'm doing air quotes, religious liberty executive order that directed the Departments of Health and Human Services, Labor, and Treasury to consider changes to the ACA's birth control benefit. We actually didn't see any rulemaking on that until October 2017, and that's when they issued interim final rules, those three departments. And I'll talk about sort of the details of the rules. But an interim final rule is essentially a kind of rule that goes into effect immediately. There is a chance for folks to write comments, but those comments don't change what is happening in the immediate time frame of that rule going into effect. So the rule could be finalized and changed potentially, but an interim final rule really is in effect then. And what we did see was that people were really outraged at the rules that the Trump administration proposed. We saw, from our Reproductive Rights and Health Coalition broadly, over 550,000 comments against the rules were submitted. And, no matter what administration it is, they're required by law to read and consider every comment that is submitted. And so we didn't see the administration finalize those interim final rules until November 2018. And they did so without making any changes to the rules. There was like one or two tiny word tweaks, but no substantive changes, despite the fact that so many people had spoken out and that they were doing it in a process that was blatantly illegal. The rules were discriminatory for all of the reasons we're going to talk about the lawsuits. But I think the other thing to note is that they finalized the rules literally the day after the November 2018 election. And, it was a real blow, just sort of in terms of what the feeling was that day in the world and where we were headed. And then at the end of the day, they finalized these rules. And it was pretty clear, like they didn't want to have to make anyone talk about them before the election, when they were out on the campaign trail, right? Because birth control is super popular. The birth control benefit is very popular. And I think they didn't want to have to force anyone to talk about what they were ultimately planning to do. But what the rules themselves do, which is they grant really sweeping exemptions to the Affordable Care Act's birth control benefit. So whereas the prior rules had a very narrow exemption for churches and other houses of worship that object to birth control coverage, the Trump administration's rules, and there's two of them. The first one allows any employer or university to deny birth control coverage based on religious objections. And then the second rule allows nonprofits or for-profits that are not publicly traded and universities to deny birth control coverage based on moral objections. And one commonality between the rules, which I think is really important, especially in terms of the impact, is that in both the Trump administration's religious exemption rule and the moral exemption rule, they say that the accommodation continues to exist but is optional, right? So it's at the discretion of the objecting entity as to whether they participate in the accommodation, which ultimately means that there's no guarantee that people in those health plans are going to get the coverage that they need through that third party, right? So the example I used earlier, if you work at that hospital that objects to birth control coverage, it is literally up to the hospital board or the CEO or whoever's making that decision whether they will use the accommodation or not, whether you get birth control coverage or not. So it's the impact is pretty devastating for folks.
And like if you're objecting, the odds are you're not going to want to accommodate.
Yeah. I mean, I think,
maybe not,
and that's one of the things that we don't know and is problematic with the rules is that it's not like you can go and, look up the employer on some database that Health and Human Services or Labor is holding on to that says, oh, your employer does object or your employer uses the accommodation. There's no tracking of it. So there's very little transparency. And, part of the Trump administration's justification in the rules is, people would know whether they're applying for a job at a hospital that is religiously affiliated based on the name of the hospital or the other kinds of indicators. And we know that that's simply not true. Number one, because a lot of these places don't have names that indicate that they're religiously affiliated. And I think the other part of that that's really important to note is that we know that folks with lower literacy and lower health literacy are less likely to pick up on those cues that indicate that a provider or a health insurance company is religiously affiliated. So we know that when folks are applying for jobs, they're going to have that same barrier and not necessarily know. So it's really problematic that we don't know. There are entities out there that haven't filed lawsuits, so they could potentially think the accommodation isn't too bad for them, but there's no way to know.
Right.
There's no way to know.
Okay.
But I think, the the administration's rules they're a drastic departure from prior law. The case that we're going to talk about, it's Hobby Lobby on steroids, right? It's to the extreme. And they're trying to let virtually every kind of employer out of the birth control benefit. So it violates Hobby Lobby, which said they need to ensure that people get birth control coverage, as well as the order from the Zubik case, which said you have to reach a resolution that would ensure women's access to birth control. And the rules, if they were in effect, they would leave people on their own to find and pay for contraception. And, it's just discrimination. There's no other way to say it.
Okay. So does that bring us to the cases?
Yeah, let's talk about the cases. So I think the place to start is knowing that, and this, it's not unique to the birth control cases, but the state attorneys general have been really on it in terms of filing cases against a lot of the Trump administration's rules. So we saw very quickly after the interim final rule was released that the case that ultimately is now making its way to the Supreme Court was filed by Pennsylvania and New Jersey together. There was another case that was led by California that has about a dozen states on it. That was filed pretty quickly. Massachusetts filed a case as well. And so, big shout out to the state attorneys general who've been doing amazing work for the last several years, including on this case. And, what we ended up seeing with the Pennsylvania and New Jersey case, the district court blocked the rules. It was a really strongly worded decision. There's a nationwide injunction issued against the rules, which means that nowhere across the entire nation can these Trump rules go into effect. So I think that's a really important take home for folks is no one's birth control coverage should have changed yet because of the Trump birth control rules, because of this nationwide injunction. The Trump administration obviously appealed that decision to the Third Circuit, and the Third Circuit affirmed it. And I think what's very interesting and part of what is you'll hear them talk about in the Supreme Court is that there were folks trying to intervene in this case. And those folks are an order of nuns called the Little Sisters of the Poor. And attempting to intervene means trying to become a party to the case. And they're essentially saying, we have a stake in this and we should be a party here. The Third Circuit denied their request, and the Little Sisters of the Poor and the Trump administration both appealed the Third Circuit's decisions, petitioned the Supreme Court to hear them, and the court agreed to hear both cases in 1 hour of consolidated arguments. And I will say, the court decided to hear this case with the original schedule of oral arguments. This was going to be the last case. I mean, they really picked it out of the group of cases that were still sitting in front of them as one they wanted to hear this session.
Right.
So that's what the case is. But what the issues in the case are really is, did the Trump-Pence administration have authority to issue these rules? They didn't. Long story short. Were they properly issued? No. But they're also considering whether lower courts, like the district court and this court, can issue nationwide injunctions in this case, in these types of cases, and whether the Little Sisters of the Poor can intervene. Every lower court, so in this case, in the California case, in all the other cases that have considered the question of whether the administration could issue these rules, has agreed that they can't, right? It's not a tough question. They didn't do this properly, but, that is one of the questions that's coming up. And then the one other case that I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about is that we, National Women's Law Center, we filed a case on behalf of our clients, Irish for Reproductive Health, with our co-counsel at Center for Reproductive Rights and Americans United for Separation of Church and State, against both the Trump administration's rules and the University of Notre Dame for a settlement agreement that the administration and Notre Dame entered into. And so that case, right now, it's stayed because of the Supreme Court decision that's forthcoming. The judge said he thinks that will be enlightening as to handle our case, but that is also out there and pending as well.
Okay, so the case is coming up soon when this comes out. I think it's actually going to be argued the next day. So a good primer for what to expect. So what would it mean if the Supreme Court were to rule in favor of the Trump administration? What would happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of different questions, right, that are going to be before the court. I think the thing that is most, at least in my mind, the thing that is the question I'm focusing on, right, is if these birth control rules go into effect, if the nationwide injunction is gone and they're going into effect, what does that mean for people in real life, right? We haven't had the rule in effect yet. Hundreds of thousands of people could lose their birth control coverage. And, I don't want that to sound too alarmist, but it's real, right? We know that 61.4 million people have this birth control coverage right now. So the vast majority of people will continue to have their birth control coverage. But, for hundreds of thousands of people, this will be a real impact on their life. And the folks that I think about when I think about who is this going to impact are the people for whom, the price of birth control is going to be out of reach for them some or most of the year, right? When they look at their budget, how can they make ends meet and pay for this healthcare when it's not covered by their health insurance, right? So thinking about low-wage workers who are and other folks who are struggling to make ends meet, who are facing barriers to care. So I think about, nurses assistants, folks who are right now who are considered essential workers during the coronavirus crisis, who potentially are going to be losing their birth control coverage. And that is really scary to think about what that looks like, particularly in the middle of a public health crisis. But, the impact is really highlights. And I think, what we've been going through over the last 6 weeks, 2 months is seeing how systemic barriers to care impact people's health outcomes. And what would happen with the birth control rule is along those same lines, right? If you face barriers to care because you live in an area that you can't get to care, or because you have that cost barrier now, or because of discrimination, or because there aren't providers that you can trust in your community, all of those things impact people's health outcomes. And I think we would see the same thing with the birth control rules. But, and it's not just about birth control, right? So birth control is so critical to people's health, but also their equality, their ability to participate in society on equal footing. their economic security. So your ability to decide if you want to have kids, when you want to have kids. Is it now? Is it when you finish the school that you're in now? Is it when you get a promotion? Is it when you get the next job? Like, those are such crucial decisions in people's lives. And birth control plays a huge part in all of that. So if your access to birth control is threatened, all of those other things are threatened and undermined as well.
Yeah, and I think that it all is especially poignant right now with everything that's happening, with so many people losing their jobs or losing a steady source of income. Yeah.
And I think that's a really good point, because I think most people know, but most families are dual income families, right? So people are, for folks who still have their jobs and folks who still have their health insurance, they may still be dealing with financial setbacks because their partner or their parent that they live with or their cousin, whoever it is that's in their family unit, has lost their job, right? So having no cost birth control coverage is so important for everyone right now, because of, everyone's facing these kinds of tough questions of what's next and how do I sustain myself through this?
Okay, so I think another thing you wanted to talk a little bit about was the number of great amicus briefs that have been submitted to the Supreme Court on behalf of birth control.
Yeah. It's sometimes sometimes in the work, it can be really tough because we're up against these Trump rules. We know that, there are folks in this administration, there are folks in the judiciary, there are folks particularly in the Senate who are not supportive of access to birth control. But then, you get the day that you get to read the amicus briefs that are sent to the Supreme Court in support of Pennsylvania and New Jersey's case. And it feels really, really good because you get to see, really the breadth of folks who are supporting this, right? It's not just your typical repro groups that are, on record with the Supreme Court saying, these rules are wrong. These rules were illegally issued. These rules should never go into effect. It's, the members of Congress brief, which had 185 members sign on, which is a really amazing number, particularly given that, just a little time frame that we were trying to get, folks were trying to get sign on for that was during the coronavirus crisis. So as you can imagine, members have a lot of high priority things, and to get that many on at that time, I think was really impressive. There was a brief filed by a set of corporate entities, over a dozen corporations, plus the U.S. Women's Chamber of Commerce, talking about why contraception is important for business and important for women in business, which is fantastic. And companies that people know and love, right? So you've got Ben & Jerry's, Lush, Seventh Generation, The Riveter. And it's great. I think it's great to see folks coming out and saying, yes, of course, birth control is important and, it's part of healthcare and should be covered. Lots of support from religious leaders, from labor groups, also saying from the workers' perspective, birth control is really important. From LGBTQ groups talking about, why birth control is important within their communities, but also what the impact could be over the long term, the precedent this case could set in terms of excluding care. And also, healthcare providers, right? So I think that's a really important voice in all of this to say birth control is important for our patients, for the clients that we see, and really to lend that air of the health service side of this and why it's important for people to have access to birth control, to time and space their pregnancies as they see fit, and for their own safety in a lot of cases. So it's a nice day to get to read all of those, take a look at those briefs and see, our great coalition of people who are out there and that are really reflective of what the real world thinks about birth control.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned was LGBTQ groups and what that could mean for some of the challenges that we have coming around access to care. So what are some of that makes me think of, what are some of the larger questions and implications that SCOTUS is considering in this case, or could have impacts on things later?
Yeah. I mean, I think, folks who have read or may have remembered hearing Justice Ginsburg's line in the Hobby Lobby dissent that was quoted all over the place, and I think is really prescient, is, she said, "The court, I fear, has ventured into a minefield," right? And we are solidly right in the middle of that minefield that she envisioned right now. So the question that she was really pointing to, and that I think a lot of this leads up to, is, how can the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, be used, right, in the future? Is it a shield which protects individuals from enforcement of a law that would violate their beliefs? That's how it was originally intended. Or is it a sword, which is how we're seeing this administration and private entities use it these days, right? Like going out and slashing at the ACA birth control benefit with no regard to the harm to other people. And that is, I think, a huge part of what the long-term impact of this case is going to be, in addition to access to birth control, right? So in terms of LGBTQ specific services, that's something that I think folks are very concerned about, how the precedent of RFRA in this case would be used. I think another area, and this is why we saw, the American Academy of Pediatrics submitted a brief in this case warning about how this precedent, if these rules go into effect, it could be a precedent to undermine vaccination requirements, which are crucial to public health and, security. That's on people's minds right now, hugely on their minds. Like, when is there going to be a vaccine for coronavirus? And, will people do it? Are we going to get herd immunity? How do we get to a point where it's safe? And, I think this is right on point there. If it wasn't, if folks could exclude it, like if your boss thought that the vaccine was, junk science, would it be excluded from your health plan? And then how could you get it if it was unaffordable? It's a real challenge. So that is one of the big things, I think, that we are going to see coming out of the opinion in this is where do we go from here with RFRA? One of the other things that I think is important is the question about nationwide injunctions that the court is going to take up. I started by talking about how great the state attorneys general have been. And one of the ways that they and others have really been able to keep a lot of the bad rules, that's what I call them to my kids, the bad rules that the president and his administration have tried to put into place, is nationwide injunctions. It keeps the rules from going into effect. So if the court says anything more broad about nationwide injunctions than the ones specifically in this case, I think that is something to be keeping an eye on. But, particularly in this case, when you think about it, there's a reason why a nationwide injunction makes sense, right? So the nationwide injunction is in a case related to Pennsylvania and New Jersey, but people live their lives across state lines, right? You may work for a company in Pennsylvania and live in Delaware, or live in Maryland, or someplace else. And, just because your company's insurance in Pennsylvania says we're not going to comply, we're not going to comply, it shouldn't impact what's happening in other states and your rights. So, health insurance is confusing and it's tricky, but, the insurance can't follow different rules in different states, at least, from my understanding of it. So I'm hopeful that we don't get something expansive and bad around nationwide injunctions. But I think the other signal to me in terms of this case is how quickly and how committed to appealing this to the Supreme Court the Trump administration was. And I think it's another sign of what we already knew, but right, that this administration is very committed to obstructing access to birth control services. And that's, this case attacking the rules attacking the birth control benefit. It's everything that happened around the Title X rules and those cases, undermining Medicaid through, the block grants and or the block grant proposals and the work requirements, which thankfully have been, very successfully challenged in court. But, at every place that they could try to undermine access to birth control, they really are. And so, it's part of this broader conservative agenda that aims to make it more difficult for women and to be equal members of society. There are a number of cases, and we're going to see these decisions coming out in June, probably end of June or potentially earlier, about whether folks can be equal members of society. And a lot is at stake this term. So it's a lot to be paying attention to. And I know there's a lot going on for people right now. But, the court is still in session, still hearing these cases and, preparing opinions in others. And it's important to keep an eye on it and to know what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, there's some pretty major things happening this term with LGBTQ rights, trans rights in particular.
Yep.
And the abortion case, the Louisiana case that's up there, and now birth control. I mean, there's a lot. There is
a lot. And, I think the bottom line is, I think, at least in our case, I am the Pennsylvania brief, Pennsylvania and New Jersey's brief was really fantastic. And I think did a really, really good job explaining why these rules, were issued in a way that was illegal, why Hobby Lobby and Zubik both necessitate that these rules can't go into effect. But, that does not allay my concerns given the composition of the court. And, I'm going to be very interested to hear, because we're all going to have the opportunity to listen to oral arguments, which is actually kind of, a wonky excitement. But to hear what happens in oral argument and then to ultimately to read, in the opinions, how that all plays out. I think, Pennsylvania and New Jersey did a fantastic job, and they've done a great job arguing these cases up through the courts. So, I'm hopeful, but I'm also realistic about, who's up there and who they're dealing with. So.
Okay. So with that, we usually end with what can listeners do? So is there anything listeners can do right now?
Yeah, well, so I would say, we are having a digital rally at 3 p.m. on May 5th. So if you are listening to this before 3 p.m. on May 5th, you can RSVP and get the link. And so you can RSVP at nwlc.org/rally for birth control. And that's going to be, we typically, for folks in DC and folks sometimes come from other places on the day of a big oral argument, have a big gathering in front of the Supreme Court for oral arguments. Obviously, we're not all gathering in one place right now, but we're really hopeful that the digital rally can be a space that folks will feel some of that solidarity that we usually get when we're rallying together, but from the safety of their own home. So there's going to be speakers, music, there's going to be ways for folks to, make their own poster at home and share it with people. So we're excited about that. And then I would also say, tune into the live stream if you're into that, right? Like listening to the oral arguments. It's pretty unique that you can hear it, at the same time that it's happening. And I think that is something, a lot of folks have an interest in that becoming the norm for the court, that it's not just the few who get to be in the room and hear it, because it's not actually a very big room. Not many people get to be in there most of the time. So I think it's a great opportunity to listen. And I think the other thing just generally is, in your conversations with people, as you're having Zoom happy hour or, whatever it is that you're doing to connect with people, talking about the case, talking about why birth control is important, making sure people know that these cases are still happening. The court isn't just on pause. because it really is all of our rights at stake, right? So our right not to be discriminated against is at stake here. And people should know that that's really out there and it's really happening. So I would say, do what you can and just know that a lot of us are here and working on it. And we would love to have you join us in the rally in particular.
So the one other thing I've been doing while everybody is trapped at home and a lot of people are stressed is what is making you happy right now. So I'll start. I made a cherry chocolate loaf of bread this weekend, and I have been having it like toasted in the oven every morning for breakfast. So it's been like melty chocolate deliciousness, and it has just made me very happy this week.
Oh, that sounds delicious. I would say, and I would not have guessed if you had told me I was almost 6 weeks into being at home that this would have been the thing, but I have started running more. I typically would say I do not like running, but I'm finding now that it is like the most effective way to get some of the, anxiety out of my body. And I'm enjoying it, which is unexpected, but good. I'm happy about it.
That's nice.
Yeah. And enjoying nature while I'm doing it, right? That's part of it. I like seeing the spring flowers.
Getting outside for a little while.
Yeah.
Well, Mara, thank you so much for doing this.
Of course. I'm always happy to join and really love that you are putting all of this out there into the world for folks. So thank you.
Okay, thanks for listening. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. As always, if you have any questions, comments, topics you would like us to cover, always feel free to reach out. You can email me at jenny@reprosfightback.com, or you can reach out to us on social media. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at reprosfightback, and you can find us on Instagram at reprosfb. Hope everybody has a good 2 weeks, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay, bye. For more information, including show notes from this episode and previous episodes, please visit us at our website at reprosfightback.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at reprosfightback and on Instagram at reprosfb. If you like our show, please help others find it by sharing it with your friends, and please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening.